The cold metal of the shackles didn't hurt as much as the whispers. The village elders stood in a circle, their eyes filled with a terrifying mix of pity and relief. To them, Ember Lawson was a bargaining chip, a peace offering to the shadows of the forest. "She is yours," Mayor Holloway stammered, his voice trembling as he gestured toward the pale, trembling girl. The towering figure in the shadows stepped forward, his eyes burning like molten amber. He didn't look at the gold. He didn't look at the elders. He looked only at her, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that shook her soul. "You're not safe with me," he growled, his hand closing around her wrist. "But here, you are already dead." Riverview was a village built on the edge of a lie. Nestled in the deep, verdant lap of the mountains, it was a place of thatched roofs, blooming apple orchards, and a deep-seated fear of the dark. For 22 years, Ember Lawson had walked its cobblestone streets as a ghost in plain sight. She was the girl touched by the moon, the one with hair the color of starlight and eyes like a gathering storm. While the other girls spent their afternoons weaving ribbons for the spring festival, Ember found herself drawn to the tree line, where the air tasted of pine needles and secrets. The only anchor to her humanity was the silver crescent pendant at her throat, her mother's final gift. "Never take it off, Ember," her mother had whispered with her dying breath. "The world is a hungry place for those who are different. This is your shield." Ember felt the weight of that shield now, more than ever, as the village celebrated the harvest. The square was a riot of orange and gold, filled with the scent of roasted meat and mulled cider. But the joy felt hollow. Tonight was the night of the partnerships, a tradition where young women were paired with local men to work the spring planting. In reality, it was a matchmaking ritual designed to keep the village's bloodlines pure and predictable. "Ember, stand straight," her sister Clara hissed, adjusted the collar of Ember's dress. Clara was the village's pride, dark-haired, practical, and fierce. Since their parents' accident 3 years ago, Clara had become Ember's protector, her wall against the biting comments of the elders. "Don't look at the forest, look at the mayor. If you're lucky, they'll pair you with Thomas the blacksmith. He's kind, even if he's quiet." "I don't want Thomas," Ember whispered, her fingers tracing the worn surface of her pendant. "I don't want any of this, Clara. Can't you feel it? The air, it's vibrating." Clara looked at her with a mixture of love and exasperation. "It's just the drums, Ember. Please, just for tonight. Be normal." But the drums didn't sound like thunder. They sounded like a heartbeat. As Mayor Holloway took the stage, his ceremonial vest straining over his belly, a sudden silence fell over the crowd. It wasn't the respectful silence of a ceremony. It was the suffocating silence of a predator's approach. The torches lining the square flickered, their flames bowing as if a great wind had passed through them. Then came the howl. It wasn't the high-pitched yip of a mountain wolf. It was a resonant, ancient sound that seemed to pull at the very marrow of Ember's bones. The heavy wooden gates of the village, reinforced with iron to keep the wild out, groaned on their hinges. They didn't break. They simply opened, as if the wood itself recognized its master. A procession of men entered the square. They didn't walk. They prowled. Each was taller than the strongest villager, dressed in leathers and furs, their eyes reflecting the torchlight with an inhuman glow. At their center was a figure who seemed to command the very shadows. Alpha King Dominic Blackest. His presence was a physical weight. His hair was as black as a moonless night, falling over broad shoulders that looked capable of carrying the weight of the mountains. But it was his eyes, amber, piercing, and ancient, that stopped Ember's heart. He didn't look at the terrified mayor or the men reaching for their hunting knives. His gaze swept the crowd with surgical precision until it locked onto Ember. The pendant at her throat began to pulse with a sudden, searing heat. "The treaty," Mayor Holloway gasped, falling to his knees. "My lord, the tribute is ready. We have the grain, the cattle." "I did not come for grain," Dominic said. His voice was like gravel wrapped in velvet, a sound that made the villagers flinch. He stepped toward the platform, the crowd parting like a receding tide. He stopped directly in front of Ember. "She carries the mark," Dominic stated, his eyes never leaving Ember's. "She is just a girl." Clara stepped forward, her voice trembling but defiant. "She's human. She's my sister. You have no right." Dominic's gaze shifted to Clara for a fraction of a second, and the pressure in the air spiked. Clara's breath caught, her knees buckling under the sheer force of his will. He turned back to Ember, his hand reaching out. He didn't touch her, but his fingers hovered near her cheek, testing an invisible boundary. "The moonstone hides much," he murmured, his voice softening just enough for only her to hear. "But it cannot hide the scent of royalty. You have been a bird in a cage of sparrows, Ember Lawson. But the cage is breaking. I don't belong to you," Ember managed to whisper, though her body felt like it was betraying her, leaning toward his warmth. "You belong to your blood," Dominic countered. He looked at the mayor. "The debt of this village is settled. In exchange for the girl, the Blackest Pack will grant you 10 years of protection. If you refuse..." He let the sentence hang, a low growl rippling through his chest. The mayor didn't hesitate. "Take her." She was always different. A burden. Ember felt a coldness wash over her that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The people she had grown up with, the neighbors she had helped, the elders she had respected. They were all nodding. They were trading her life for their safety. "Ember, no!" Clara screamed as 2 of Dominic's warriors stepped forward to restrain her. Dominic reached out and gripped Ember's wrist. His skin was unnaturally hot, a feverish contrast to her own icy limbs. He pulled her toward him, his strength effortless. As he turned to lead her toward the gates, toward the dark, hungry mouth of the forest, he leaned down, his breath stirring her hair. "Do not mistake this for a rescue, little one," he growled, the sound vibrating against her skin. "The mountains are waking up. There are things in the dark that have been hunting you since the day you were born. You're not safe with me." He looked back at the forest, his eyes glowing with a predatory intensity. "But out here, I am the only thing they fear." Ember looked back one last time. She saw Clara struggling in the arms of the warriors, her face a mask of grief. She saw the villagers returning to their cider, already forgetting the girl with the starlight hair. Then, the shadows of the pines swallowed them whole, and the only sound left was the rhythmic thud of a king's heart against her own. "Stop. Would you like me to continue?" Section 2. The Fortress of Stone and Secrets. The forest was not the wall of darkness Ember had imagined. Instead, it was a cathedral of shifting light and ancient whispers. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, the silence of the village was replaced by a symphony of life. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the undergrowth felt magnified. Dominic moved through the terrain with a predatory grace that made Ember feel clumsy in her thin village shoes. He didn't speak, but his awareness of her was constant. When she stumbled over a protruding root, his hand was there instantly, steadying her elbow before she could even gasp. His grip was firm, but he released her the second she regained her footing, as if her touch burned him as much as his burned her. "Where are you taking me?" she finally asked, her voice trembling in the crisp mountain air. Dominic didn't look back. "To the only place where your blood won't act as a beacon for every scavenger in the range." My blood is just blood, she snapped, a spark of her sister's fire lighting in her chest. I am a girl from a mountain village. I grow herbs and mend clothes. Whatever story you've told yourself to justify stealing me, it's wrong. Dominic stopped. He turned slowly, the moonlight catching the hard angles of his face. For 22 years, you have lived in a village that feared the sound of their own footsteps. You have worn a stone around your neck that suppresses your very heartbeat. You think you know what you are? You haven't even begun to wake up. He turned and continued walking, leaving Ember to follow him into the shadows of the rising peaks. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon, they reached the foot of a massive ridge. Emerging from the mist like a titan was Blackest Keep. It wasn't a castle built of mortar and brick. It was carved directly into the living stone of the mountain. Arches of pale granite flowed into natural caverns, and terraces hung over the valley like the nests of great eagles. As they passed through the massive ironwood gates, Ember braced herself for a dungeon. Instead, she found a community. The courtyard was bustling with life. Women in thick wool tunics carried baskets of medicinal roots. Children with unnaturally bright eyes chased one another in the morning light. Warriors sparred with wooden staves, their movements blurred with inhuman speed. They all stopped as Dominic entered. The atmosphere didn't fill with fear, but with a profound, grounded respect. "Helena," Dominic called out. A tall, regal woman with silver-streaked dark hair stepped forward. She looked at Ember with eyes that were clinical, but not unkind. "So, the rumors were true. Elra's daughter has returned." "She knows nothing," Dominic said shortly. "She believes she is a prisoner. Show her to the eastern wing, my mother's old rooms. See that she is fed and clothed. And Helena, keep the guards at a distance. She is skittish." "I am not skittish," Ember protested, pulling her cloak tighter. "I am kidnapped." Dominic's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, leaning down until they were eye to eye. "If you were a prisoner, you would be in the pits. If you were a tribute, you would be dead. You are here because the world is about to change, and you are the only one who can navigate the crossing. Try to eat. You'll need your strength." He walked away without a backward glance, his heavy cloak billowing behind him. Helena led Ember deep into the keep. The corridors were warm, heated by thermal vents from the mountain's heart. Soft tapestries and oil lamps lined the walls, depicting a history of wolves and humans living in a delicate, often bloody balance. The rooms Ember was given were more luxurious than anything she had ever seen. A massive bed piled with furs, a hearth where a fire already crackled, and large windows that looked out over the sprawling forest below. "Your mother was happy here for a time," Helena said softly, standing by the door. Ember turned, her heart racing. "You knew her?" "My mother never spoke of this place. She spoke of Riverview. She spoke of the safety of the village." "She was protecting you," Helena replied. "She thought that if she could hide the wolf in her, she could hide it in you. But nature cannot be buried forever, Ember. A storm is coming from the east. A pack led by a man named Darius, who believes that pure blood is the only thing that matters. He wants to wipe out the humans and the diluted alike. And you think I'm the key to stopping him? Because of a pendant? I think you are the daughter of a queen who chose to live as a human," Helena said, her voice filled with a strange sort of empathy. "And I think Dominic is trying to keep you alive in a world that is suddenly very hungry for your soul." After Helena left, a young woman named Lyra brought a tray of food. Lyra was cheerful and talkative, a stark contrast to the brooding intensity of the Alpha. She explained that she was Pack, but not a shifter, a human who had been born into the community. "The Alpha is a hard man, it's true," Lyra said, as she laid out a dress of soft blue wool. "He took the mantle when he was only 19, after his father was killed in a border skirmish. He's had to be a wall for us. But he's fair. He won't hurt you, Ember." Ember sat by the window, staring at the forest. She felt like she was caught in a dream that was rapidly turning into a nightmare. She missed the smell of Clara's bread. She missed the predictable safety of her old life. But as she touched the crescent pendant, it felt cold. For the first time, it didn't feel like a shield. It felt like a lock. Late that night, unable to sleep, Ember stepped out onto the terrace. The mountain air was thin and freezing, but it felt honest. She looked down at the courtyard and saw a lone figure standing by the well. It was Dominic. He was stripped to his waist despite the cold, his back covered in a map of silver scars. He was staring at the moon, his muscles tense, his hands gripped white-knuckled on the stone edge of the well. He looked lonely. Ember felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to go to him, to ask why he had really brought her here. But as if sensing her gaze, he turned. His amber eyes caught the moonlight, glowing with a primal, terrifying light. He didn't call out to her. He didn't wave her away. He simply stood there, a king of shadows, looking at the girl he had stolen from the light. Ember stepped back into the warmth of her room, her heart pounding against her ribs. She told herself it was fear. She told herself she hated him. But as she lay under the furs, the image of his scarred back and solitary stance burned in her mind. She was in the heart of the monster's den, but for some reason, the monster was the only thing making her feel like she finally existed. The third day in Blackest Keep felt like living inside a beautiful, heavy secret. Ember spent her hours wandering the accessible parts of the fortress, guided by a silent but watchful Lyra. She found herself in the Hall of Ancestors, a long gallery where the history of the pack was etched into wood panels. Here, she saw her mother's name, Elra Moonblood. It was carved near the image of a great white wolf, a symbol of a lineage that had once acted as the heartbeat of the mountains. She was meant to lead, Helena said, appearing behind Ember with the quietness common to all shifters. But she fell in love with a human guard, a man from your village. In the eyes of the old laws, it was a betrayal. In her eyes, it was a choice for peace. She didn't choose peace, Ember said, her voice tight. She chose a life of hiding. She chose to make me a ghost. She chose to keep you alive, Helena corrected gently. But hiding a fire doesn't put it out, Ember. It only makes the eventual blaze more dangerous. Ember turned away, her mind swirling. She still held on to the belief that if she could just reach Clara, if she could just explain things, they could find a way back to their cottage. She believed the village had traded her out of fear, not malice. It was a mistake of the heart, a desperate hope that her 22 years of life hadn't been a lie. That afternoon, Ember found herself near the training grounds. She watched from a stone balcony as Dominic moved among his warriors. They were shifting, a blurring of bone and fur that happened so fast, it was like a trick of the light. Dominic remained in his human form, his presence enough to command the massive wolves that lunged and parried around him. He was a teacher as much as a king. He corrected a younger warrior's stance with a firm but steady hand. He spoke in low tones, encouraging rather than belittling. There was a profound sense of responsibility in every movement he made. Ember's heart gave a traitorous thud. She saw the burden of his kingship, the way he looked at his people not as subjects, but as a family he was terrified of losing. Sensing her presence, Dominic looked up. The intensity of his amber gaze felt like a physical touch. He left the training circle and ascended the stairs to the balcony, his chest heaving slightly from the exertion, the scent of rain and pine radiating from him. "You look like you're planning an escape," he said, leaning his forearms against the stone railing. "Is it an escape if I'm returning to where I belong?" Ember asked, though the word belong felt suddenly fragile. "You belong where you are protected," he replied, I was protected in Riverview. I had a sister. I had a life. Dominic let out a short, hollow laugh. You had a cage, Ember. You think those villagers didn't know what you were? Why do you think you were always the odd one? Why do you think your mother was so afraid? They were my friends, she insisted, her voice rising. Thomas, the mayor, they were my people. Dominic stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. They knew the legends. They knew that as long as a Moonblood was in their village, the pack wouldn't touch them. They didn't love you, Ember. They used you. You were their insurance policy against the dark. And the moment a higher bidder came along, the moment I offered them 10 years of peace, they sold their policy. That's a lie, she whispered, her eyes stinging. You're just saying that to make me stay. I don't need lies to make you stay. The gates are open, Ember. You could walk out right now. He gestured toward the valley. But tell me, why did your mother wear that pendant? Why did she make you swear never to remove it? To keep me safe. To keep you hidden, he growled, the vibration echoing in the stone. Because she knew that if the village saw the wolf in you, they wouldn't just pity you, they would kill you. Humans fear what they cannot control, and they hate what they fear. He reached out, his hand hovering near the silver crescent at her neck. For a moment, Ember thought he would rip it away. Instead, his thumb brushed the skin just above the metal. The heat of him was overwhelming, a magnetic pull that made her breath hitch. You're not safe with me, he said again, his voice dropping to a pained whisper. Because being with me means accepting the truth. It means seeing the world for the hungry, beautiful, terrifying place it is. It means no more hiding. Ember pulled away, her heart racing with a mixture of anger and a dawning, terrifying realization. She needed to know for sure. She needed to see the truth of her home for herself. That night, she convinced Lyra to help her. I just need to send a message to Clara, Ember pleaded. Just a letter to let her know I'm alive. If Dominic is right about the village, the letter won't matter. But if he's wrong, she needs to know. Lyra, moved by Ember's distress, agreed to give the letter to a scout who was heading toward the border. Ember wrote with trembling hands, pouring her heart into the parchment, asking Clara to meet her at the old oak tree on the border of the village lands. For 2 days, Ember waited in a fever of anxiety. She avoided Dominic, unable to look at him without feeling the foundation of her world crumbling. On the 3rd night, Lyra returned, but she didn't have a letter. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed. The scout returned, Ember, Lyra whispered, handing her a small, crumpled object. It was the letter Ember had written. It hadn't been opened. It was tied to a stone, and on the back, in the mayor's handwriting, were 3 words that felt like a knife to the soul. Do not return. Beneath it was a smaller scrawl, a different hand, one she recognized as Thomas, the blacksmith's father, the village elder. The girl is dead to us. Keep the peace. Ember felt the air leave her lungs. She looked at the paper, then at the moon through the window. There was no mention of Clara, no word from her sister. Just a cold, calculated rejection. Dominic hadn't lied. The village hadn't been her sanctuary. It had been a prison that had finally decided she was no longer worth the cost of the bread she ate. A sudden, violent sound erupted from the courtyard, the sound of iron clashing and the frantic howling of wolves. They're here, Lyra gasped, grabbing Ember's arm. The Eastern Pack. Darius. He's bypassed the scouts. Ember stood frozen, the paper fluttering from her hand. The falsehood of her past was gone, replaced by a brutal, immediate reality. She wasn't a girl from a village anymore. She was a target. And the only man who had told her the truth was currently standing between her and a nightmare. As the first scream echoed through the keep, Ember realized her greatest mistake wasn't trusting the Alpha. It was believing she had ever been safe at all. The stone walls of the keep, once a symbol of cold isolation, now felt like a trembling ribcage around a heart under attack. The air was thick with the copper tang of blood and the acrid stench of smoke. Outside, the world had turned into a nightmare of shadows and silver. Ember stood at the edge of the great hall, her breath coming in shallow hitches. Through the arched windows, she saw the Eastern warriors, massive, scarred shifters who moved with a mindless, frenzied violence. Unlike Dominic's pack, which fought with a disciplined, protective rhythm, Darius's men fought like a plague. "Ember, get back!" Dominic's voice cut through the din. He was at the center of the courtyard, a whirlwind of lethality. He wasn't in his wolf form yet. He stood as a man, wielding a heavy claymore with a terrifying, fluid precision. His chest was slick with sweat and rain, his eyes glowing with that incandescent amber light. Every time a shadow lunged for him, he didn't just strike. He stood as a wall for the weaker ones behind him. He saw her, and for a split second, the warrior's mask slipped. A look of raw, unadulterated fear for her safety crossed his face. He vaulted over a stone balustrade, landing beside her with a force that cracked the flagstones. "I told you to stay in the inner chambers," he growled, grabbing her shoulders. His hands were shaking, not with fear, but with the effort of holding back the beast within. "My sister," Ember gasped, clutching his forearms. "The village. If they rejected me, where is Clara? Dominic. She would never have let them send that letter. She would have fought them." Dominic looked away, his jaw tightening so hard a muscle pulsed in his cheek. "Ember, there is no time. Tell me the truth," she screamed over the sound of a collapsing wooden watchtower. "You said no more hiding. Tell me what you know." Dominic looked into her eyes, and the truth revealed hit her with the force of an avalanche. "Darius didn't just bypass the scouts," Dominic said, his voice a low, pained vibration. "He went through the village first. He knew your mother's blood was there. He gave them a choice. The girl with the star hair or everyone else. They gave him you. But he took Clara as insurance." The world tilted. The peace the village elders had written about wasn't a trade for grain or cattle. It was a trade of one sister for the safety of the rest. Ember felt a cold, jagged hollow open in her chest. Her sister, her fierce, protective Clara, was in the hands of a monster because the people they had called family were too cowardly to stand. "Why?" Ember whispered, her voice breaking. "Why does he want us so badly? We're just humans." "You are not human," Dominic roared, the sound echoing off the stone. He reached out and gripped the silver crescent pendant. "This stone, it's not just a shield, Ember. It's a dampener. Your mother didn't just flee a pack. She fled a prophecy. You are a royal white, the first in 3 generations. Your blood is the only thing that can unite the packs or destroy the barrier between our worlds forever." He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers for a fleeting, desperate second. The heat between them was no longer just a physical sensation. It was an ancient recognition. "Darius doesn't want to kill you," Dominic whispered. "He wants to claim you. He wants to use your blood to trigger a permanent shift in his warriors, to turn them into something that never has to be human again. He wants a world of eternal winter and endless hunger." I can't be that," she sobbed. "I'm just Ember." "You are the bridge," Dominic said, pulling back to look at her. "And bridges are built to withstand the storm. I brought you here to protect you, yes. But I also brought you here because you are the only hope my people have of not becoming the monsters Darius wants us to be." Suddenly, the great doors of the hall shuddered. A massive, gray wolf, nearly the size of a mountain pony, burst through, its eyes a sickly, milky red. It was one of Darius's generals. It lunged not for Dominic, but for Ember. In a blur of movement, Dominic didn't reach for his sword. He stepped in front of her, and the transformation happened with a violent, bone-snapping crack. Ember watched in awe and terror as the man she had begun to trust dissolved into a creature of legend. A massive black wolf, larger than any other, intercepted the gray predator midair. The sound of their collision was like two boulders smashing together. Dominic, the black wolf, pinned the intruder to the floor, his growl a sound that vibrated in Ember's very marrow. He didn't just kill the creature, he ended it with a swift, brutal efficiency that spoke of a king defending his most precious treasure. He turned his massive head toward her. His amber eyes were still Dominic's eyes, filled with an agonizing intelligence and a fierce, protective love that he had never permitted himself to say in words. He nudged her hand with his muzzle, the fur soft, but the power beneath it unmistakable. He was telling her to run to the high towers, where the healers and children were hidden. But Ember didn't run. She looked at the silver pendant at her throat. She looked at the black wolf, who was bleeding for a girl who had spent her life pretending she was nothing. The truth wasn't just about her blood or the prophecy. It was about her choice. She reached for the clasp of the pendant. Her fingers trembled, but her gaze was fixed on the rising blood moon through the smoke-filled sky. She realized that by staying safe, she was letting everyone she loved die. "Dominic," she whispered. The black wolf paused, his ears twitching. "I'm not a ghost anymore." She went to pull the clasp, to finally face the moment of tension that would decide their fate, but a horn blast from the eastern ridge stopped her heart. It wasn't a call to battle, it was a call to parley. Through the chaos, a voice amplified by the mountain's echoes drifted into the hall. "Alpha King, I have the elder sister. She is quite a firebrand, but she burns so easily. Bring me the moonblood, or watch the village's pride turn to ash." Dominic let out a piteous, haunting howl. Ember dropped her hand from the clasp, her face turning ashen. Darius wasn't just attacking, he was playing with her soul. The truth was fully revealed now. She couldn't just hide in the keep, and Dominic couldn't just be her shield. The battle outside began to lull into a tense, suffocating standoff. Ember looked at Dominic, who had shifted back into his human form, his skin covered in grime and blood, his chest heaving. He looked at her with a devastating realization. "He has her," Ember whispered. "I know," Dominic replied, his voice a ghost of itself. "And he knows you'll come for her." He stepped toward her, his hand hovering over hers, not touching, but offering a silent, desperate support. The choice was no longer about her nature. It was about the impossible price of love. The blood moon hung over the mountains like a heavy, weeping eye. Its light stained the snow-capped peaks a bruised violet, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to crawl across the earth. The air was unnaturally still, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting for the first drop of royal blood to hit the soil. Dominic stood at the gates of the keep, his breath visible in the freezing air. He had cleaned the worst of the gore from his face, but he still looked like a man made of flint and sorrow. His warriors stood behind him, a wall of fur and steel, their eyes fixed on the torches flickering on the eastern ridge. "He wants a spectacle," Dominic murmured, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Darius doesn't just want power. He wants to break the spirit of the blackest pack. He wants them to watch their alpha fail to protect his own." Ember stepped up beside him. She had traded her blue dress for a tunic of boiled leather and heavy furs provided by Lyra. She felt small, but the hollow cold in her chest had been replaced by a white-hot, singular purpose. "He won't break you," Ember said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Because you aren't fighting for power. You're fighting for them." She gestured to the healers tending to the wounded in the courtyard. Dominic turned to her, and for a moment, the Alpha King was gone. There was only a man who had carried the weight of a dying peace for too long. He reached out, his gloved hand cupping the side of her face. The gesture was so tender, so profoundly human, that it hurt more than his growls ever had. "Ember," he whispered, "if this goes wrong, if he tries to take you, I need you to run. Not to the village, to the high passes. Helena knows the way." "I'm not running, Dominic," she replied, leaning into his touch for a fleeting second. "Every time someone in my life tried to protect me, they ended up lying to me. My mother, the village, even you. I'm done being protected. I'm going to be part of the solution." Dominic's thumb traced the line of her jaw. "You're not safe with me," he repeated, but this time it wasn't a warning. It was an apology. "I know," she smiled sadly, "but I'm not safe anywhere else either." They began the ascent toward the ridge. It was a brutal climb, the path narrow and slick with ice. Dominic walked ahead, his senses dialed to an impossible frequency, scouting for the hidden traps Darius was fond of. As they reached the plateau, the scent of the eastern pack hit them, a rancid metallic odor that spoke of madness and uncontrolled shifting. At the center of the ridge, surrounded by a circle of snarling warriors, stood Darius Silverfang. He was a man of jagged edges and cold, calculating eyes. Unlike Dominic, who wore his power like a heavy cloak, Darius wore his like a weapon. Beside him, bound to a charred wooden post, was Clara. "Ember." Clara's voice was hoarse, her face bruised but her eyes still flashing with that familiar, stubborn fire. "Don't do it. Run." A warrior struck Clara across the face, and Ember let out a strangled cry, her hand flying to the pendant at her throat. "Easy, little wolf," Darius called out, his voice a sharp contrast to the low rumble of the mountains. He stepped forward, his gaze raking over Ember with a sickening greed. "You've spent so much time hiding in that stone cage. Don't you want to breathe? Don't you want to feel the moon in your marrow?" "Let her go, Darius." Dominic stepped forward, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "The girl is here. Your quarrel is with me. Leave the human out of this." Darius laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "The human is the only reason she hasn't shifted yet. She's clinging to that pathetic little spark of mortality like it's a life raft. But the tide is coming in, Dominic." Darius grabbed Clara by the hair, tilting her head back to expose her throat. He held a curved dagger made of obsidian, a blade designed to spill blood for ritual, not just for death. "Here is the deal, Alpha King," Darius sneered. "The girl removes the stone. She embraces her blood. She joins me, and I let the sister walk back to her pathetic little village. If she refuses, I kill the sister. I burn your keep to the ground, and I take what's left of the moonblood by force." Ember looked at Clara, who was shaking her head frantically. She looked at Dominic, whose muscles were so tense they looked like carved stone. He was ready to lunge, ready to die to give her a split second to escape. But Ember knew Dominic couldn't win that fight, not while Clara was a hostage. The moment of tension stretched until it felt like a physical wire about to snap. Ember felt the silver crescent pulse against her skin. It wasn't cold anymore. It was burning. The moon above seemed to be screaming at her, calling for the wolf that had been suppressed for 22 years. She felt the mistake of her past, the years of pretending, the years of being a ghost, crushing her. She realized that by holding on to her humanity so tightly, she was actually being selfish. She was choosing her own comfort over the lives of everyone around her. "Ember, don't," Dominic whispered, his eyes pleading. He knew what happened to those who shifted without preparation. He had seen the madness it caused in her mother. Ember ignored him. She stepped forward, leaving the safety of Dominic's shadow. She stood in the center of the ridge, the blood-red moonlight bathing her in a ghostly glow. "You want the wolf, Darius?" she asked, her voice echoing off the cliffs. Darius grinned, showing teeth that were already beginning to sharpen. "I want the queen." "Then let her go," Ember commanded. "Let Clara walk to the edge of the ridge. The moment she is safe, I will take it off." "Ember, no," Clara sobbed. "Quiet, Clara," Ember said, not looking back. "It's my turn to protect you." Darius signaled his men. They untied Clara, shoving her toward the path that led back down the mountain. She stumbled, looking back at Ember with a face full of agony. "Go, Clara!" Ember shouted. "Run! Don't look back!" Clara hesitated. Then, seeing the resolve in Ember's eyes, she turned and fled into the darkness of the tree line. Darius turned back to Ember, his eyes wide with anticipation. "Now, the stone. Show me the royal blood, little one." Ember reached for the clasp. She felt Dominic's gaze on her, a mixture of devastation and a fierce, heartbreaking respect. He knew he couldn't stop her. This was her choice. Her fingers touched the cold silver. She thought of her mother's warnings. She thought of the village's rejection. And then she thought of the black wolf who had bled for her. She didn't feel like a ghost anymore. She felt like a storm. "You're not safe with me," she whispered, echoing Dominic's words. But she wasn't talking to him. She was talking to Darius. She pulled the clasp. The silver crescent fell from her neck, hitting the frozen earth with a dull thud. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Then, the world exploded into a blinding white light, and the first scream that tore through the ridge wasn't human. As the silver clasp fell away, a tiny click echoed through the ridge like a clap of thunder. A light of pure, blinding white erupted from Ember's chest. It was not a scorching flame, but a cool, radiant aura, like winter moonlight, enveloping her small frame in a ghostly glow. Darius narrowed his eyes, letting out a roar fueled by both greed and primal fear. The Eastern warriors recoiled, shielding their eyes from the sudden, majestic authority radiating from the girl. Dominic, even in his human form, felt a surge of ancient power ripple down his spine. He held his breath, witnessing the moment that would rewrite the history of the werewolf kind forever. In Ember's mind, the shards of pain were gone. She was no longer a prisoner of lies. She wasn't the weird girl of Riverview, nor a piece of property to be bartered. She felt every muscle and bone singing a hymn of freedom. The pain of the transformation was nothing like what her mother had endured, because Ember did not fight it. She embraced it. She welcomed the wolf within like a long-lost friend who had been forgotten for far too long. As the brilliance faded, the figure standing on the peak was no longer a trembling human girl. She was a legend, the royal white wolf. She was magnificent, larger than any wolf in the pack, yet she possessed the fluid, lethal grace of a snow leopard. Her fur was pure white, shimmering as if woven from the very silk of the moon. Her eyes, once a stormy gray, now glowed with molten silver, deep, ancient, and piercingly wise. Her presence stilled the air, which had been heavy with blood and hatred. The Eastern wolves, driven mad by Darius's dark influence, suddenly lowered their bodies, tails tucked in absolute submission. It was not a surrender to force, but a profound reverence for the purest bloodline, the light their ancestors had worshipped for centuries. Ember, in her wolf form, held her head high. She did not roar. She simply took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the ancient forest and the warmth of Dominic standing behind her. "I am no longer afraid." Her voice did not sound in words, but vibrated through the soul link to everyone present. Darius, in a fit of desperation and madness, shifted. He became a massive gray wolf, covered in scars and the foul stench of cruelty. He could not accept that a human girl possessed power far beyond his own. He lunged at her with feral aggression, his sharp fangs aimed at her throat. But Ember moved so swiftly she seemed to vanish into thin air. She did not use brute strength to crush him. She drifted like a white ghost, every step on the frozen ground, leaving behind faint, glowing traces of moonlight. As Darius stumbled and lunged at nothing, Ember appeared directly behind him. She did not tear into him. She simply placed a paw upon his shoulder. A surge of powerful yet calm energy flowed through him, causing Darius to collapse onto the stone, his body trembling as if bound by invisible lunar threads. Dominic stepped to her side. He did not shift. He knew that violence was no longer the answer. He looked into Ember's silver eyes and saw, for the first time, the balance spoken of in the prophecy. She possessed the raw power of the wolf, but her heart remained full of the compassion and justice of a human. Ember looked down at Darius, who was whimpering at her feet. She saw the terror in his eyes, the fear of a creature realizing he had lost, not to a greater fist, but to a light that shadows could not touch. At that moment, the roars of the blackest pack warriors echoed from the distance. They had broken the siege and were rushing toward the peak to protect their alpha and their new queen. The tide had completely turned. But just as Ember prepared to take the final step to exile Darius, a plume of black smoke erupted from behind the rocks. In a desperate, cowardly act, Darius's last loyalists threw oil bombs at the cliff face above where Clara stood. The sound of a rock slide thundered through the night. A massive boulder was hurtling toward her sister. Ember stood trapped between a choice: finish the enemy at her feet, or risk everything to save the only family she had left. Her silver eyes blazed, and the entire mountain seemed to tremble with the frantic beat of her heart. The silence that followed the fall of the pendant was not empty. It was the heavy, pressurized quiet before a mountain peak collapses. For 22 years, Ember's soul had been muted. A melody played behind a thick velvet curtain. Now, the curtain was gone. The first thing she felt was not pain, but a terrifying, beautiful clarity. The world didn't just brighten, it ignited. She could hear the frantic scurry of a field mouse 3 miles down the valley. She could smell the ancient, icy breath of the glaciers. She could feel the magnetic pull of the Earth's core. Then came the fire. It started in her marrow, a white-hot surge of energy that made her skin hum. Unlike the jagged, bone-breaking agony she had heard described, this felt like a homecoming. It was a shedding of a too-tight skin. Her bones didn't just snap, they elongated and sang, reshaping into a form that had been waiting in the shadows of her DNA since the first moon rose over the world. A blinding, lunar-white light erupted from her center, forcing Darius and his warriors to shield their eyes. Dominic, however, didn't look away. He watched with a raw, spiritual awe as the girl from the village vanished, and in her place stood a creature of myth. She was a royal white, larger than the average wolf, but built with a terrifying, feline elegance. Her fur was the color of fresh snow under a winter moon. Her eyes were no longer a stormy gray. They were twin pools of molten silver, glowing with an intelligence that was both ancient and deeply, piercingly human. Darius stepped back, his greed momentarily replaced by a primal, instinctive fear. "Magnificent," he whispered, though his hand shook as he reached for his sword. The prophecy. It wasn't a warning. It was a blueprint. Ember, the white wolf, stood her ground. She didn't snarl, she didn't lunge. She simply looked at Darius, and the sheer weight of her presence made the eastern warriors drop to their bellies, their submissive whimpers filling the ridge. Dominic, still in his human form, felt the bond snap into place. It wasn't a leash, it was a bridge. He could feel her thoughts, not in words, but in colors and pulses of emotion. He felt her love for Clara, her grief for her mother, and a sudden, fierce protectiveness for him. "You are not alone," the feeling vibrated through his mind. Darius, realizing his control was slipping, let out a desperate, guttural roar. "You are mine. I am the Alpha of the East. You will bow." He shifted, his form a messy, violent explosion of gray fur and twisted muscle. He lunged at Ember, his claws aimed at her throat. But Ember was no longer the girl who stumbled over roots. She was the mountain itself. She moved with a speed that defied the eye, a blur of white light that intercepted Darius midair. She didn't meet his violence with rage. She met it with a cold, divine authority. With a single, powerful sweep of her paw, she sent the Eastern Alpha crashing into the stone monoliths at the edge of the ridge. The impact was deafening. The Black Wolf, Dominic, was beside her in an instant. He didn't shift to join the fight. He stood by her shoulder, his presence a dark anchor to her blinding light. Together, they looked like the beginning and the end of the world. Darius struggled to rise, his gray fur matted with blood. He looked at his warriors, but none moved to help him. They were looking at the White Wolf. In the presence of the royal blood, his pure ideology was revealed for what it was, a hollow, pathetic excuse for cruelty. Ember stepped toward him, her paws silent on the frozen earth. She didn't kill him. Instead, she leaned down, her silver eyes inches from his milky red ones. She let out a low, resonant rumble. It wasn't a growl of hunger. It was a command of exile. Darius shivered, the fight leaving him all at once. He realized then that he couldn't claim the queen, because the queen belonged to the balance, and he was the rot that the balance sought to purge. He turned, shifting back into a broken, trembling man, and fled into the darkness of the eastern passes. His warriors followed, not out of loyalty, but out of a desperate need to be away from the light that had judged them. The ridge fell silent. The blood moon was fading, the crimson tint giving way to the soft, pale gold of a new dawn. Ember turned to Dominic. The adrenaline was fading, and the appearance of the wolf began to soften. She felt the pull of her humanity, the need for the human heart that the prophecy said must be retained. She shifted back. It was a slow, graceful reversal. As she stood in the center of the ridge, wrapped only in the furs Dominic had thrown over her the moment she became human again, she looked exhausted, but whole. Dominic walked to her, his movements hesitant, as if he were afraid she would shatter. He reached out and touched her cheek. "Ember," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer hide. "I'm still here," she said, her voice small but certain. "I kept the heart, Dominic." He pulled her into his arms, hiding his face in her hair. The Alpha King, the man who was not safe, wept silently against the shoulder of the girl who had saved them all. But the peace was fragile. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, Ember looked toward the tree line where Clara had disappeared. The battle was won, but the healing had only just begun. The descent from the Crimson Ridge was slow, not because of the terrain, but because the world itself seemed to be breathing anew. The harsh, blood-red light of the eclipse had been washed away by a morning of pale gold and soft lavender. The snow was no longer stained with the shadows of war, but sparkled with the promise of the coming spring. Dominic walked beside Ember, his hand never leaving hers. He didn't lead her anymore. They walked as equals, their strides perfectly in sync. For the first time in his life, the Alpha King's shoulders didn't look burdened. He looked like a man who had finally found the missing piece of his own soul. As they reached the gates of Blackest Keep, a small figure broke away from the huddle of healers and guards. "Ember!" Clara's voice was a sob of pure relief. She collided with Ember, her arms wrapping around her sister, with a strength that spoke of years of shared hardships. Clara pulled back, her eyes searching Ember's face, lingering on the new silver depth in her eyes. "I saw it," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "From the tree line. I saw the light. I saw you." Ember took Clara's hands, her touch warm and grounding. "I'm still me, Clara. Just more. All the parts Mother tried to hide, they're here now. But I'm still your sister." Clara looked at Dominic, then back at Ember. A slow, understanding smile touched her bruised lips. "You always were too big for that village, Ember. I think I knew it, even when I was trying to keep you small, just to keep you safe." The reconciliation didn't end there. Later that morning, a small group of villagers, those who hadn't fled with the elders, stood at the edge of the keep's territory. Among them was Thomas the blacksmith, looking ashamed and hollow. They had seen the fall of the Eastern Pack. They had felt the pulse of the royal blood. Dominic moved to step forward, his jaw tightening into the mask of the king, but Ember placed a hand on his chest. "Let me," she said softly. She walked to the boundary where the stone of the mountain met the grass of the valley. She didn't speak of vengeance or the betrayal that had sent her into the dark. She spoke of the bridge. "The village is not our enemy," Ember said, her voice carrying through the morning air with a resonant, calm authority. "Fear was the enemy, but the shadows that hunted you are gone. We will honor the treaty my mother died for, but not through secrets, through truth." She looked at Thomas. "Go back. Tell them the White Wolf protects the valley. But tell them that peace isn't something you trade for. It's something you build." The villagers bowed, not out of terror, but out of a sudden, profound hope. As they departed, Ember felt the last of the jagged cold in her chest melt away. Evening fell over Blackest Keep, bringing with it a deep, restorative quiet. Ember stood on the high terrace, the same place where she had once watched Dominic in his loneliness. The crescent pendant lay on the stone railing before her. It was no longer a cage. It was a relic of a past she had outgrown. Dominic stepped out from the shadows, his presence a warm, steady weight. He stood behind her, his arms circling her waist as they both looked out over the vast, silver-tipped forest. "I have something for you," he whispered, leaning his forehead against hers. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small, carved wooden box. Inside was a new pendant, not a moonstone, but a piece of raw, amber-colored mountain glass, encased in a simple, hand-forged silver frame. "It doesn't hide anything," Dominic said, his amber eyes locked on hers. "It doesn't dampen the wolf or protect the heart. It's just a reminder that you are seen, all of you." Ember felt a tear track down her cheek, a human tear, filled with a joy that was almost too large to contain. She realized then that the safe he had spoken of was never about the absence of danger. It was about the presence of a partner. "You're not safe with me," she whispered, a playful, loving spark in her eyes as she repeated his growl from the first night. Dominic smiled, a real, radiant smile that transformed his face. He leaned down, his lips brushing hers with a tenderness that promised a lifetime of healing. "No," he agreed, his voice a low, happy rumble. "But we are finally home." They stood together as the stars began to poke through the twilight. Below them, in the courtyard, a fire was being lit, and the sounds of laughter and music began to drift up. A new song for a new world. The image was quiet, the mountain was still, and for the first time in 25 years, the balance was restored. Thank you so much for joining me on this cinematic journey into the heart of the Blackest Pack. Writing the story of Ember and Dominic, the bridge between the human heart and the primal wolf, reminds us that our greatest strength often lies in the parts of ourselves we are most afraid to show. If you enjoyed this tale of romance, destiny, and the power of choice, please hit that like button and share it with someone who loves a deep, emotional story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more long-form cinematic adventures. Until next time, keep following the light of the moon.